The kitchen table was covered in bills again. David sat there at 2 in the morning, calculator in one hand, coffee in the other. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but sleep wouldn't come anyway. Between the rent, his kids' school supplies, and the never-ending stack of expenses that came with being a single dad, he was barely keeping his head above water. His daughter Katie would need braces soon. The dentist had made that clear at her last appointment. His son Tommy wanted to join the soccer team, and David hated saying no. But the registration fees alone would wipe out what little he'd managed to save. The apartment they rented was getting smaller by the day, or maybe his kids were just getting bigger. Either way, 3 people sharing a 2-bedroom place with paper-thin walls wasn't working anymore. David worked as an electrician, and he was good at it. Real good. People called him all the time, recommending him to their friends and neighbors. But working for someone else's company meant he only saw a fraction of what clients actually paid. He'd thought about starting his own business, but that took money he didn't have. Everything took money he didn't have. The divorce had been rough. Not angry or dramatic. Just sad and necessary. He and Jennifer had grown apart, wanted different things, and neither of them could pretend anymore. She'd moved 3 hours away for a job opportunity. And while she helped with the kids when she could, the daily reality of raising them fell on his shoulders. David didn't resent it. He loved his kids more than anything. But some nights, sitting alone with a pile of bills, he felt the weight of it all, pressing down on him. That's when he started looking at property listings online. Not seriously at first, just dreaming. Scrolling through pictures of houses with big yards where his kids could actually play outside, places with enough bedrooms that Tommy wouldn't have to sleep on the couch anymore. But everything within an hour of the city cost more than he'd make in 5 years. Then one night, in late August, he found it. An old farmhouse listed for a price that seemed impossible. He actually laughed out loud, thinking it had to be a mistake. The photos showed a weathered 2-story house with peeling paint and overgrown gardens. The windows were dirty, the porch sagged a little, and the whole place looked like nobody had lived there in years. But the bones were good. David could see that even through the screen of his phone, and the listing mentioned 12 acres of land. 12 acres. He read the description 3 times. The house had been empty for almost 3 years, since the previous owner passed away. Her children lived out of state, and just wanted it sold. They'd dropped the price twice already. It needed work, sure, but David knew how to work. He'd been swinging a hammer since he was 15, learning the trade from his grandfather. Electrical, plumbing, carpentry. He could do most of it himself. The location was about an hour outside the city, which meant a longer commute. But if he could actually own a place, really own it, not throw money away on rent every month. The idea took root in his mind and wouldn't let go. David called the realtor the next morning. A friendly woman named Patricia answered and seemed almost surprised by his interest. She was honest with him, maybe more honest than she needed to be. The place was rough. Really rough. No one had maintained it properly in years. The roof probably needed work. The septic system was old. But the price reflected all of that. And yes, it was available for immediate showing if he wanted to drive out. That Saturday, David dropped the kids at his sister's place and made the drive. Patricia met him at the property, and as he turned down the long gravel driveway, his heart sank a little. The photos hadn't quite captured how run down everything looked. The grass was waist-high in places. The barn in the back was missing half its roof. An old tractor sat rusting near the tree line, but then he walked through the front door, and something shifted. The house was solid. The floors didn't bounce or creak too badly. The walls were straight. It smelled musty and forgotten, but not rotten. Patricia showed him around, pointing out problems as they went. Water damage in the upstairs bathroom. Outdated electrical panel. Kitchen from the 1970s. The whole place needed cleaning, painting, and updating. David walked through each room slowly, his mind already working. He could replace that wiring himself. The bathroom would take some time, but nothing he couldn't handle. The kitchen just needed cosmetic work, really. New cabinets, fresh paint, different appliances. He stepped out onto the back porch and looked at the property stretching out behind the house. Woods in the distance. Open fields. Space for his kids to run and play and just be kids. Patricia seemed to sense his interest. She told him about the previous owner, an elderly woman who'd lived there for 40 years. Her husband had died young, and she'd raised her 3 kids in this house by herself. Worked in town as a teacher. Kept a garden. The neighbors remembered her fondly. After she passed, the kids couldn't agree on what to do with the place, and by the time they decided to sell, it had been sitting empty too long. David asked about the price again, still not quite believing it. Patricia confirmed the number and explained that the family just wanted it gone. They'd tried renting it out, but had problems with tenants. They lived too far away to manage it properly. At this point, they'd take any reasonable offer just to be done with it. That night, David couldn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't from stress. He ran the numbers over and over. With his savings and a small loan he thought he could qualify for, he could actually do this. The mortgage payment would be less than his current rent. Sure, he'd need money for repairs, but he could do most of the work himself. Take it slow. Focus on making it livable first, then improve it over time. He thought about Tommy having his own bedroom, about Katie having space to do her homework without sitting at the kitchen table, about having a yard where they could get a dog, something they'd talked about but couldn't do in the apartment, about building something real, something he could pass down to them someday. 2 weeks later, David sat in a title company office signing more papers than he'd ever seen in his life. Patricia smiled at him encouragingly. The seller's attorney looked bored. David's hand cramped from signing his name so many times. And then, it was done. He owned a house. An actual house. The keys felt heavy in his palm, full of possibility and promise. He drove out there that same afternoon, alone. Walked through the empty rooms that now belonged to him. Stood in the backyard and looked at the sunset, painting the sky orange and pink. For the first time in years, David felt something other than tired. He felt hopeful. The plan was simple. He'd spend the next few weeks getting supplies together, making lists, figuring out what needed to be done first. His work schedule was packed, but he could come out on weekends, maybe take a few days off, get the worst of it handled before winter, then move the kids out next summer when school let out. David locked the front door, pocketed the keys, and headed back to the city. He had no idea that when he returned 3 weeks later, nothing would go according to plan. 3 weeks felt like forever when David was excited about something. Every spare moment at work, he'd been sketching plans on scraps of paper. What to fix first. Where to start. He'd priced out lumber and drywall, bought a new circular saw, and loaded his truck bed with supplies until the suspension groaned. His sister had agreed to take Katie and Tommy for the weekend, and he'd mapped out a full 2 days of solid work at the farmhouse. The drive out felt different this time. He actually owned that property now. The trees lining the county roads looked brighter somehow. The morning sun cut through the September fog, and David found himself smiling at nothing in particular. His work playlist was cranked up, and he drummed his fingers on the steering wheel at every stoplight. He'd been so busy with back-to-back electrical jobs that he hadn't made it out since closing day. But that was okay. The house wasn't going anywhere. Today, he'd focus on the roof. He'd spotted some questionable shingles during his first visit, and with fall coming, he needed to make sure everything was watertight before the rain started. As David turned down the long gravel driveway, his foot eased off the gas pedal. Something was different. He couldn't put his finger on it at first, but the feeling crept up his spine like a cold hand. The grass. The grass had been cut. Not all of it, but the area right around the house looked trim and neat. His truck crunched to a stop near the front porch, and that's when he saw it. Smoke. Thin gray smoke was rising from the chimney, curling up into the morning air. David's heart started hammering against his ribs. Someone was in his house. His house. The house he'd scraped together every penny to buy. He sat there, gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing through possibilities. Squatters, maybe. He'd heard about that happening in empty properties, or kids using it as a party spot. Vandals. The thought of damage to the place he'd worked so hard for made his stomach turn. He pulled out his phone, thumb hovering over 911. But what if it was nothing? What if he'd misremembered about the grass? Maybe the realtor had arranged for lawn service as part of the sale. And the smoke. Could there be another explanation? No. He knew what he was seeing. David climbed out of his truck slowly, leaving the door open in case he needed to get back in fast. He approached the front porch, and that's when he noticed more changes. The boards he remembered being loose were nailed down. The cobwebs were gone. There were curtains in the windows. Actual curtains. With a floral pattern. His work boots felt heavy as he climbed the 3 steps to the front door. He tried to peer through the window, but the curtains blocked most of his view. He had every right to walk in. But something made him knock instead. The knock sounded too loud in the quiet morning. David waited, holding his breath. He heard footsteps inside. Multiple footsteps. More than one person. The door handle turned, and the door swung open. A woman stood there looking at him with mild confusion. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with gray hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore an apron dusted with flour and held a dish towel in her hands. Behind her, David could see into the kitchen. The kitchen he'd walked through 3 weeks ago. It looked completely different now. Clean. Organized. There were dishes in the drainer, a kettle on the stove. The smell of something baking drifted out the door. The woman smiled at him uncertainly. "Can I help you?" David's mouth opened, but nothing came out at first. Can she help him? In his own house? Who are you? He finally managed to ask. The woman's smile faded a little. "This is my house," David said, and his voice came out sharper than he intended. "I own this property." The color drained from the woman's face. Her hand gripped the doorframe like she might fall over. "What?" I bought this house 3 weeks ago. I have the deed in my truck. What are you doing here?" Behind the older woman, another figure appeared. A younger woman, maybe late 20s, holding a baby against her shoulder. The baby was sleeping. Tiny fist curled against the young woman's neck. She looked at David with wide, frightened eyes. "Mom?" the younger woman said quietly. "What's going on?" The older woman turned back to look at her daughter, then at David again. Her face had gone from confused to horrified. "There must be some mistake. This house, it's been empty for years. We've been staying here because why?" David demanded. He wasn't trying to be harsh, but his mind was reeling. His house. "Because you just decided to move into someone else's property?" The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know it had been sold. I worked here. For Mrs. Whitmore. I was her housekeeper. For 15 years. When she passed, I still had keys, and I just thought, you thought you'd move in?" David couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice. "No, not like that." The woman was crying now, wiping at her eyes with the dish towel. "We were desperate. My daughter, we had nowhere else to go." The younger woman stepped forward, still holding the sleeping baby. "Please don't call the cops. Please. We'll leave right now. We'll go. Just give us an hour to pack our things." David looked at the baby. Couldn't have been more than a few months old. The infant was so small, so peaceful against his mother's shoulder. The young woman's hands were shaking. "I need to understand what's happening here," David said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "Why don't you start from the beginning?" The older woman nodded, still crying. Can we sit down? I'll explain everything. I promise. We're not criminals. We're not trying to steal from you. She broke down, covering her face with her hands. The younger woman put her free arm around her mother's shoulders. She looked at David with a mixture of fear and resignation, like she'd been expecting this moment, like she'd known it would come eventually. "My name's Beth," she said quietly. "This is my mom, Carol. And this is my son, Ryan. We've been living here for 2 weeks. We didn't damage anything. We actually fixed some things. Please, just let me explain before you call the police." David stood in the doorway of his own house, looking at these 2 women and a baby who'd somehow taken up residence without him knowing. He thought about his own kids, about Katie and Tommy waiting at his sister's house, excited about their dad's new property. He thought about all his plans, his dreams for this place, and he thought about the fear in these women's eyes. "All right," he heard himself say. "Let's sit down. You've got some explaining to do." He stepped inside his farmhouse, closed the door behind him, and wondered what on earth he'd just walked into. The kitchen table was the same one David had seen during his first visit, but it looked completely different now. Someone had scrubbed it clean and covered it with a cheerful yellow tablecloth. Carol poured coffee into mismatched mugs with trembling hands while Beth settled into a chair, still holding baby Ryan. David sat across from them, his mind spinning with questions he didn't know how to ask. Carol set a mug in front of him and sat down heavily. She looked older somehow than she had standing in the doorway moments ago. Tired. Defeated. She wrapped both hands around her own coffee mug like she needed the warmth. "I don't even know where to start," she said softly. "Start with why you're here," David said. He tried to keep his voice gentle, but it still came out harder than he meant. This was his house. These were strangers, sitting at his table. Carol took a shaky breath. "I worked for Mrs. Whitmore for 15 years. Started when I was 47. Right after my divorce. She was the kindest woman I ever knew. Paid me fair. Treated me like family. When her health started going downhill, I was here almost every day. Cooking, cleaning, making sure she took her medications. Keeping her company." Beth shifted the baby in her arms. Ryan made a small sound but didn't wake up. "Mom practically lived here. Those last 2 years. Mrs. Whitmore's kids lived out of state," Carol continued. "They'd visit maybe twice a year. She used to talk about them all the time. But I could tell it hurt her that they were so far away. When she passed, they came for the funeral, and that was it. Packed up her personal things and left. Didn't even ask if I needed anything." David sipped his coffee. It was good. Really good. Better than he made at home. That must have been hard. I was devastated, Carol said, her eyes getting wet again. She was more than just someone I worked for. She was my friend. But I understood. People have their own lives. The house just sat here empty after that. I'd drive by sometimes, and it made me sad seeing it like that. All those memories. Just forgotten. "But you kept the keys," David said. Carol nodded. "I kept the keys. I don't know why exactly. Maybe part of me thought the family would call and ask me to check on the place. They never did. The house just sat here, month after month. I heard through people in town that they were trying to sell it." Beth finally spoke up. "I didn't know any of this. I was living 2 hours away with my boyfriend. We had an apartment, jobs, everything seemed okay. Then I got pregnant." She looked down at Ryan, and her whole face changed, softened. "When I told him about the baby, everything fell apart. He didn't want to be a father. Started drinking more. Getting angry. One night he pushed me, and I fell." David felt his chest tighten. "I called my mom that night." Beth continued. "She drove 2 hours to get me. We grabbed what I could fit in her car and left. I filed a police report. Got a restraining order. All of it. But I had nowhere to go. Mom was living in a tiny studio apartment. Barely enough room for her, let alone me and a baby. We stayed at a shelter for a while, Carol said quietly. Those places, they do important work. But it's hard. Really hard. Sharing a room with 6 other women. No privacy. No space. Beth was about to have a baby, and I kept thinking about how we'd manage with a newborn in that environment. Beth wiped her eyes with her free hand. Ryan was born in August. The shelter let us stay another 2 weeks. But then they needed the bed for someone else. There's always someone else who needs help. Thanks for watching. And don't knock Center 4017. We spent 3 nights in my car, Carol said, and her voice cracked. 3 nights in a parking lot behind a grocery store. Beth was trying to breastfeed in the back seat. Ryan was crying. It was hot. I kept thinking about Mrs. Whitmore's house, standing empty with all those bedrooms. All that space, nobody was using. David set down his coffee mug. He could picture it. The desperation. The impossible choices. I told myself we'd just stay a few days, Carol said. Just until we figured something out. I used my old keys to get in. The house was dusty and needed cleaning. But everything still worked. The utilities were still on somehow. Maybe the family forgot to cancel them. I don't know. We cleaned everything, Beth added quickly. We didn't trash the place or steal anything. We fixed the loose boards on the porch. Mom mowed the lawn. We were trying to take care of it. That was 2 weeks ago, Carol said. We've been looking for apartments, but everything requires first month, last month, and a security deposit. That's 3 months' rent just to move in. I'm working part-time at the library, but it's not enough. Beth had a job interview at a diner in town next week. We were trying. Beth had a job. End quote. We were really trying. The kitchen fell quiet, except for Ryan's soft breathing. David looked around the room. They'd cleaned the windows, organized the cabinets. There were flowers in a vase on the counter. Wildflowers from the property, probably. These women hadn't just been squatting here. They'd been living here, making it a home. I know we shouldn't be here, Carol said. I know it's wrong. I didn't know what else to do. When you're desperate, when you've got your daughter and your grandson sleeping in a car, you make choices you never thought you'd make. Beth looked at David directly. We'll leave today. Right now, if you want. We've got a car. We'll figure something out. Just, please don't call the police. I can't have that on my record. I'm trying to build a life for my son. David thought about his own kids, about the bills on his kitchen table and the nights he couldn't sleep, about how one bad break, one wrong turn, could change everything. He thought about working his fingers to the bone just to keep a roof over their heads. And he thought about how close he'd come to losing it all during the divorce. Where will you go? He asked. Beth and Carol looked at each other. Neither of them answered. If you leave today, where will you go? David repeated. There's another shelter about an hour from here. Carol said quietly. We can try there. By my. Climb. With a baby? People do it, Beth said. But her voice was small. David rubbed his face with both hands. This wasn't what he'd signed up for. He'd bought this house to give his kids a better life, to build something for his family. Now he was sitting here with 2 strangers and a baby who had nowhere to go. The smart thing would be to ask them to leave. Give them a few hours to pack up. Be generous about it. But stick to his plan. But David kept thinking about those 3 nights in the car. About Beth trying to feed her newborn in a parking lot. About Carol, who'd given 15 years of her life to someone else's family, ending up with nothing. How much do you need? He heard himself ask. For an apartment. First, last, deposit. How much? Carol blinked at him. What? I'm not saying I have it, David said quickly. I'm just asking. How much would it take for you to get into a place? Beth looked down at Ryan. Most places around here want about 3,000 total. We've got 400 saved. $3,000. David felt his stomach drop. He didn't have that kind of money. He'd put everything into buying this house. But even as he thought it, another idea was forming in his mind. A crazy idea that didn't make any sense. An idea that would change everything. David stood up from the table and walked to the window. He could see his truck parked outside, loaded with all the supplies he'd bought to start renovating. Behind it, the property stretched out toward the tree line. 12 acres. More space than 3 people needed. More space than he knew what to do with. Honestly, I can't give you $3,000, he said, still looking out the window. I don't have it. Behind him, he heard Carol let out a shaky breath. We understand. We'll pack our things. But... David turned around. I've got a different idea. And before you say anything, let me finish. Because I'm still figuring this out myself. Both women stared at him. Ryan chose that moment to wake up, making soft cooing sounds. Beth automatically started rocking him gently. This house needs a lot of work, David continued. I was planning to spend every weekend out here for the next few months, doing repairs, painting, fixing everything that's broken. My plan was to move my kids out here next summer. Okay, Carol said slowly, not understanding where he was going. The thing is, I work full-time in the city. I've got 2 kids who need me during the week. I can only get out here on weekends, and even that's not every weekend. At this rate, it's going to take me a year, maybe more, to get this place ready. David pulled out a chair and sat back down. You said you worked for Mrs. Whitmore for 15 years. You know this house inside and out, right? Carol nodded. Every inch of it. I know which pipes freeze in winter, where the roof leaks when it rains hard, how the old furnace sounds when it needs maintenance. I probably know this house better than her own children did. And you, David looked at Beth. You said you had a job interview at a diner? Wednesday morning, Beth confirmed. It's just a waitressing position, but it's full-time, and they said I could work the day shift so childcare would be easier. David drummed his fingers on the table, his mind racing through possibilities. This was crazy. He barely knew these people. But sometimes crazy was the only thing that made sense. Here's what I'm thinking, he said. You stay here. For 3 months. No rent. Carol's mouth fell open. What? Let me finish. You stay here for free. But in exchange, you help me fix the place up. Carol, you know what needs to be done. You can guide me through repairs. Help with painting, cleaning, whatever needs doing. Beth, if you get that job, great. Save your money. But on your days off, if you're able, you help too. Light stuff. Nothing dangerous with the baby around. I don't understand, Beth said. Why would you do that? Because I need help. David said simply. I can't do this alone. Not with my work schedule. And you need a place to stay. This way, everybody gets something they need. Carol was shaking her head. That's too generous. You don't even know us. We broke into your house. You didn't break in. You had keys. And yeah, I don't know you. But I know what it's like to be desperate. I know what it's like to work yourself to death and still come up short. David thought about those nights at his kitchen table, drowning in bills. 3 months gives you time to save money, find a place, get back on your feet. And it gives me help getting this house ready. It's not charity. It's a fair trade. Beth looked at her mother, then at David. What about your kids? Don't they need the house? My kids are fine where we are until summer. The apartment's small, but it works for now. This place isn't even livable yet. No offense, but there's a lot that needs fixing before I'd move Katie and Tommy out here. Katie and Tommy, Carol repeated softly, and smiled a little. How old are they? Carol repeated. Katie's 12. Tommy just turned 9. David pulled out his phone and showed them a photo. His kids grinning at the camera. Katie with her arm around her little brother. "They're beautiful," Beth said. And David could see her looking at them the way she looked at Ryan. That mother's look that saw all the potential and possibility in a child. "They're good kids," David said. "And when they move out here eventually, I want this place to be ready. Really ready. Not just patched together." Carol wiped her eyes again, but this time she was smiling through the tears. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," David said. "Say you'll help me turn this place into a real home." "Yes," Carol said immediately. "Yes. Thank you. You have no idea what this means." Beth nodded, clutching Ryan closer. David felt something loosen in his chest, like he'd been holding his breath for weeks and could finally exhale. "Okay then. Let's talk about what needs doing." 1. They spent the next 2 hours walking through the house together. Carol showed David all the little problems he hadn't noticed. A crack in the foundation that needed sealing. Windows that didn't close properly. The attic insulation that was practically non-existent. But she also showed him Mrs. Whitmore's beautiful garden beds that just needed clearing. The root cellar that could be perfect for storage. The way the afternoon light came through the dining room windows, Beth proved she wasn't just talk. When David started pulling out tools from his truck, she was right there, asking how she could help. With Ryan napping in a portable crib they'd set up in the living room, she held boards steady while David measured. She swept up sawdust without being asked. She had good instincts for the work. "My dad was a contractor," she explained when David commented on it. "Before he passed, I used to help him on jobs during summer breaks. I'm not an expert, but I know my way around tools." By the time the sun started setting, they'd made real progress. David had repaired the worst of the porch boards. Carol had made a detailed list of everything that needed attention, and Beth had cleaned out the gutters on the lower sections of the house. They stood in the driveway together, tired and dusty. Ryan was awake now, and Carol was holding him, while Beth stretched her back. "I should head back," David said. "I've got to pick up my kids tomorrow morning." "Oh, will you come back next weekend?" Carol asked. "Yeah. I'll come back. We've got a lot of work to do." Beth stepped forward suddenly and hugged him. It surprised David, but he hugged her back. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do this." "Maybe I did," David said. "Maybe we all need help sometimes." As he drove away, David could see them in his rearview mirror. Carol waving with baby Ryan in her arms. Beth standing on the porch of the farmhouse that was somehow his house and their home at the same time. He thought about calling his sister to tell her what happened, but who would believe it? He'd driven out here planning to fix a roof. Instead, he'd made a deal that would change all of their lives. David turned up his music and headed toward the highway. For the first time since the divorce, since the bills and the stress and the endless worry, he felt like maybe things were going to work out after all. He just had to trust that sometimes the craziest decisions were the right ones. The first month was harder than any of them expected. David drove out every Saturday morning, sometimes bringing Katie and Tommy with him. The kids were curious about the farmhouse at first, asking a million questions about when they'd move in and whether they could get a dog. Meeting Carol and Beth was awkward initially. David had explained the situation as simply as he could, telling them that these nice people were helping fix up the house. Katie, being 12 and suspicious of everything, had asked the obvious question, "Why are they living here, if it's our house?" David had crouched down to her level. "Because sometimes people need help, and we're in a position to help them. That's what good people do." Tommy, easier to please at 9 years old, had been more interested in exploring the property. He'd found an old tire swing hanging from a massive oak tree in the backyard and spent hours on it while the adults worked. Beth got the job at the diner. She started the following Monday, working the breakfast and lunch shift. The owner, a woman named Rita, was understanding about Beth's situation and even let her bring Ryan in during slow hours. Carol watched the baby when Beth was working, And in between, she coordinated the renovation projects with David. The work was grueling. David spent his weekends painting, fixing electrical outlets, replacing rotten wood, and patching the roof. Carol worked alongside him, her knowledge of the house proving invaluable. She knew exactly which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck in humid weather, and where Mrs. Whitmore had hidden the main water shutoff valve. Beth surprised everyone with how handy she was. On her days off, she'd be up on a ladder painting trim or helping David install new light fixtures. She worked with a focused intensity, like she was trying to prove something. Maybe to David, maybe to herself. "You don't have to work this hard," David told her one afternoon. They were sanding down the living room floor together, both covered in dust. "Yes, I do," Beth said firmly. "The least I can do is help make it better." By the second month, something had shifted. The house was starting to look like a home. Fresh paint brightened the rooms. New curtains hung in the windows. Carol had planted vegetables in Mrs. Whitmore's old garden beds, and they were already starting to sprout. David brought his kids out more often, and Tommy had declared the property the coolest place ever. Katie was slower to warm up, but one Saturday, David found her sitting on the back porch with Beth, holding baby Ryan. The two of them were talking quietly, and Katie was making funny faces at the baby, who was giggling. When David walked over, Katie looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Ryan likes me," she said simply. "Of course he does," Beth told her. "You're really good with him." Something in David's chest tightened watching his daughter with this baby. Katie had been so serious since the divorce, so worried about everything. But right now, making Ryan laugh, she looked like a kid again. The 3-month mark approached faster than anyone wanted. David knew they needed to have the conversation, but he kept putting it off. Carol and Beth had saved almost $2,000 between them. It wasn't quite enough for a deposit on most places, but it was close. Beth had been looking at apartments in town, circling ads in the local paper. One Sunday evening, after a long day of work, they all sat on the newly repaired back porch. Katie and Tommy were playing with Ryan on a blanket in the grass. The sun was setting, painting everything gold and orange. "We need to talk," Carol said quietly. David had been dreading this. "I know. The 3 months are almost up," Beth added. "We've been looking at places. There's a duplex in town that might work. It's small, but we could make it work." Carol nodded. "You've been more than generous. More than we ever could have asked for. We can't take advantage of your kindness forever." 18. Marked. On Carol. With newer/problems. With newer/ David watched his kids playing with Ryan. Tommy was making the baby laugh by hiding behind his hands and popping out. Katie was supervising, making sure Tommy wasn't too rough. They looked happy, really happy. "What if you didn't leave?" David said. Both women turned to look at him. "The guest cottage out back," David continued. "It's small, but it's got good bones. Needs work, but so did this place. What if we fixed it up? You could rent it from me. A real lease, real rent, but affordable. Something you could actually manage." Beth's eyes widened. "David, you can't keep doing this." "Why not? You've both been working your tails off here." "Carol, you know every inch of this property. And, honestly," David paused, "my kids love it here. They love coming out on weekends. Tommy talks about the tire swing all week. Katie actually smiles now. And I think part of that is because of you two. Because of Ryan. But when you move out here permanently," Carol said, "won't it be strange having us next door?" David laughed. "Carol, you've seen me singing off-key while painting. You've watched me nearly fall off a ladder twice. I think we're past strange." "I don't know what to say," Beth said, her voice thick with emotion. "Say you'll think about it," David suggested. "We could fix up the cottage together. Same deal. You help with the work. I keep the rent reasonable. It's got 2 bedrooms, a little kitchen, bathroom. Perfect size for the 3 of you. Carol looked at her daughter. Beth looked at Ryan, now sitting in Katie's lap. The baby was yawning, getting sleepy as the sun dipped lower. Could we really do this? Beth asked her mother. I think we could, Carol said softly. They spent the next 3 months working on the guest cottage. It became a family project. Katie helped Beth paint the bedroom walls a soft yellow. Tommy insisted on helping David install a new mailbox for the cottage. Carol planted flowers along the walkway. Even Rita from the diner donated some old furniture she didn't need anymore. By the time winter arrived, the cottage was finished. Carol, Beth, and Ryan moved in officially, paying rent that was affordable but fair. David had drawn up a proper lease agreement. Everything was legal and above board. The main house was nearly finished too. David planned to move Katie and Tommy out the following spring, once the school year ended. The property had been transformed. What was once an abandoned, forgotten farmhouse was now a small community. 2 homes, 2 families, all looking out for each other. On Christmas Eve, they all gathered in the main house for dinner. David had brought his kids, Carol had cooked a turkey, Beth had made dessert. Ryan, now 9 months old, sat in a high chair, making a mess with mashed potatoes. Katie and Tommy were teaching him to wave. David looked around the table at these people who'd become part of his life through the strangest circumstances. He thought about that morning months ago when he'd driven out to start repairs and found smoke coming from the chimney. How angry and confused he'd been. How his whole plan had been thrown into chaos. What are you thinking about? Carol asked him. Just that sometimes the best things in life are the ones you never planned for, David said. Beth raised her glass. To unexpected blessings. To new beginnings, Carol added. To family, David finished. However it comes together. They clinked glasses, and through the window, David could see both houses lit up against the winter darkness. 2 homes on 12 acres, built not just with wood and nails, but with second chances, hard work, and the simple choice to help someone when they needed it most. He'd bought an abandoned farmhouse to give his kids a better life. What he'd found instead was something bigger. A reminder that sometimes the best way to build your own future is to help someone else build theirs.